Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Butterworth. I'm the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, part of the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the second in a series of virtual town hall events sponsored by the center. Now, we're also very fortunate today to be doing this in partnership with the Moody College of Communication, and in particular, their newly launched Moody mini-series, which is designed to connect folks from around the world, really, alumni, parents, friends, current students, supporters of the Moody College of Communication. So we're delighted that you have decided to spend some time and join us today. Our topic is one that is certain to easily fill 30 minutes or more, and that's about the amount of time we expect to spend here. And that topic is women in sports media during the COVID-19 crisis. And there are all kinds of ways that women professionals in sports media and women athletes are experiencing COVID-19 differently than we might see across sports broadly. So I'm excited to welcome an extremely distinguished panel of guests today. And our first guest, who we'll welcome one at a time, our first guest is Tamryn Spruill. Tamryn is a freelance journalist, and she is the editor of Swish Appeal. And among her bylines, she can have credits at The Athletic, Bleacher Report, and Teen Vogue. Tamryn, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for putting this together.
Absolutely, it's our pleasure. Second is Jessica Luther. Jessica is also a freelance journalist. She is the author of Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape, and the co-author of the forthcoming book, How to Love Sports When They Don't Love You Back. She is also, as you can see, one of 4 hosts of the most excellent podcast, Burn It All Down. Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. Third on our panel is Dr. Erin Whiteside. Dr. Whiteside is a professor of sports media at the University of Tennessee. And in addition to doing both her scholarship and teaching at UT, prior to, well, that's the other UT. We have a lot of UT representation today at the University of Tennessee. In this case, prior to those days, Erin was a writer for Major League Baseball. Erin, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next up is Professor Molly Yanity. Dr. Yanity is a professor of sports journalism at Quinnipiac University and a former freelance or former full-time journalist herself, and now a freelancer covering the Connecticut Sun for The Athletic. Molly, so good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Coach Butterworth. It's good to see you again.
That's great. I earned a new title today. That's exciting. And our last panelist is Dr. Guy Harrison. Guy is a professor of sports media at Youngstown State University, though we should probably give him the nod that he'll be joining Dr. Whiteside at the University of Tennessee this coming fall. And he is the author of the forthcoming book, On the Sidelines, Post-Feminism, Neoliberalism, and the American Female Sportscaster. So Guy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to welcome all of you. We're just absolutely thrilled with how this panel has turned out already, and we haven't even gotten started. So let's make sure we do that right away. And we had a lot of things going on last week in the sports media conversation. Much of it revolved around the NFL draft. And the reason why I want to start with that is because there were a number of comments that for those who follow social media, you may have seen, where sports media personnel were talking about the fact that, thank goodness, we finally have something that we can talk about and pay attention to. And oh, by the way, there were some folks who pointed out, not so fast. The WNBA draft was just a week earlier. So why don't we start there? And I know that all of you will want to have some thoughts about this. Molly, I'm actually going to have you start, if that's all right, if only because of your current assignment with the Connecticut Sun. What do you make of the response from sports media and how the eagerness to promote the NFL draft at the expense of other opportunities?
It was quite unsurprising, sadly. The WNBA arguably has its the number one pick, Sabrina Ionesco of the New York Liberty, is probably the most exciting college player to come out of the game since Shamika Holdsclaw, possibly. In WNBA circles or women's college basketball circles, there's a lot of excitement about this. It was on ESPN as opposed to one of the other stations. It was very well produced. It was exciting. There were some surprises, but it's still mostly overlooked by mainstream media.
Tamryn, you've spent go ahead, Erin. We'll have you go next. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to jump in. I also wasn't surprised. I was like, of course they said this. What I found notable, though, about the WNBA draft was during the draft, there were these really prominent athletes, male athletes, tweeting congratulations, lots of goat emojis and superlatives describing the women who were drafted. And I think that was awesome. And I think the league needs those kinds of high profile platforms to grow. But that draft was, it's one moment, it's one event, it was happening when there was nothing else going on. What we need is those high profile men to engage in everyday conversations about the WNBA, to elevate the reporting, to retweet Molly's reporting and Tamryn's reporting and Jessica's reporting, get their voices out there, I think will be more powerful than those kind of single congratulatory tweets. And I think it is really important for men to understand how they are complicit in reproducing that silence, both through what we saw during the NFL draft, these remarks about, wow, the first sporting event, finally, but also through the everyday silence. They're not perhaps engaging in outright sexism or bias towards women's sports, but certainly not acknowledging their platform and privilege to lift those voices up. And so that's what I will be looking for going forward. Are those types of congratulatory tweets going to continue as part of a regular conversation about the WNBA?
Yeah, Tamryn, you wanted to build on that.
I did, thank you. I wasn't surprised at all because every summer, as we're ramping up to the NBA season, it's, oh, basketball's going to be back finally. And it's like, well, we're nearing the playoffs in the WNBA. And some of the best, women to ever play the game, man or woman, are in the league now. They're active players. I've been on my Allie Quigley tirade for a couple of years, and she set the record for the most points scored in the three-point contest, man or woman, and that's not talked about enough. It's like when the 2019 NBA All-Star Game was around, why wasn't she invited and sitting there doing live color commentary with Reggie Miller or whoever was hosting it. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is I do appreciate the men who will retweet and congratulate the players. I really like Erin's idea for they need to be retweeting the people who cover it, who have been invested for years. But we also go right back to the newsrooms with this, because I've seen stories where the story is the player who retweeted something about a woman player, not the woman player herself. And that's hugely disrespectful and problematic. The story is LeBron, did this, or Steph Curry palled around with Sabrina Ionescu. It's like, well, she made NCAA history, man or woman, the 2,000 points, 1,000 assists, 1,000 rebound club. Nobody else has done that. That's the story. It's not that, she slapped Curry's hand courtside or whatever. So there are a lot of levels to where the complicity lies, I believe. So that's where I am on that.
Yeah, Jessica, you want to add to that too.
Yeah, and I just, Molly made a good point. I mean, Ionescu is a huge deal. She was the cover of the New York Post literally the week before. She was getting massive media coverage. And I think I'm just going to name him because why not? Adam Schefter from ESPN literally works for the network that the WNBA draft was on, was probably the most famous tweeter out there saying finally, and everyone's like, literally your network last week. And I think I was thinking about the XFL, which is folded, but we saw that ESPN had a huge buy-in with the XFL. And when that happened, like every single person who worked for ESPN was tweeting about it, was talking about it. It was on everything that they did. They were covering it from top to bottom. It was a big deal. And they have the ability to create that media and to create those feelings and all that excitement around this stuff. So there's a particular disappointment when you see someone like Adam Schefter not even recognize what's happening on his own network around women's sports. It's not surprising, like everyone said, but it will continue to be disappointing.
Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, Jessica or anyone else, what do you think ESPN's responsibility is in that scenario?
Well, I was just going to talk about something that I noticed, which is the fact that, we talk about complicity and everything. And yes, absolutely, it's a slap in the face. But, seeing the WNBA draft slighted in that fashion, it definitely has long-reaching or far-reaching implications and impacts. Even here in Youngstown, Ohio, there's a pizza shop right around the corner. They sent out a marketing email the afternoon of the NFL draft. They said, hey, we know you're not cooking tonight because the NFL draft is tonight and it's the first sporting event that, same thing that Adam Schefter said. So it's like, ESPN's responsibility is to, pump up the WNBA, which they should be doing anyway. It's a product that they're investing in. They have broadcast rights. So why not invest that money and attention? But in addition to that, they have a responsibility to see to it that these athletes are promoted just like they would the NBA players, as well as the league itself.
Guy, I noticed that on social media, you responded to Adam Schefter acknowledging his oversight, and at the very least did offer something of an apology. And the reason I mention that is because that does stand in contrast to the many comments that are very dismissive of, oh no, we mean a real sport. And the eagerness with which so many people, and perhaps this is obviously amplified in social media, but the eagerness that so many people have to denigrate a sport that they don't follow or don't care for. Molly, you're ready to respond to that, but I'm curious that's obviously bigger than the shutdown and the COVID-19 crisis. What explains that persistent need to be so dismissive?
Jessica,
We'll just go all the way through.
Jessica can answer this.
Misogyny? Go ahead, Molly, go ahead.
I got out of full-time sports writing in 2009 to pursue this second career. And so that was right before Twitter started. I jumped back in this summer with The Athletic, and just for full disclosure, I'm no longer doing that. They hired someone full-time, which I'm very thankful they did. But this summer was the first time I have experienced the social media blowback personally. And the misogyny, that is the answer. It's just straight up misogyny. But we're talking about ESPN's complicity. And Guy, why aren't they promoting their own programming, their own investment? Everybody, the three of you have been at conferences with me and heard me harp on this before. ESPN created a market, created a fan base for poker. There was no big demand for poker, and they created that, and they created stars to go along with it. They showed this regularly. They, had commercials and the whole thing. And the one thing that always comes back to me when we talk about coverage and we talk about highlights on SportsCenter or Adam Schefter conveniently forgetting about it is if they can create a market for poker, all they have to do is pay attention, and they just have to want to do it. I'm sure MGM or Caesars or something went into some kind of partnership with them to get that coverage and to create that. But then that also begs the question, why isn't the NCAA doing that? Or why isn't the NBA putting forth that sort of effort with ESPN to help this market? Because the product is there. And I've followed the WNBA since day one. I worked with ESPN Internet Ventures back in the late 90s, and was an editor of WNBA.com. And the product is just exponentially better. And yet we're still reading these just ridiculous comments from little men or bots. Like half the time I'm like, is this person even real? Could you be that dumb? But it just blows my mind because ESPN and NCAA or NBA, all they'd have to do is just a little effort and you'd see Quigley. Yeah.
Oh, please
All
go
right.
ahead, Tamryn.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I feel that this really goes to the heart of who gets decision-making powers, who gets the high-level programming jobs. Traditionally, we're talking about a space that is mostly men, mostly white men. So if women are marginalized there, it's going to be, is anybody in the room to advocate for better coverage? Is anybody in the room to make sure that before Adam takes to Twitter, that he knows what's going on in his own network? And obviously that doesn't seem to be the case. There just seems to be a commitment to keeping things status quo, with crumbs kind of doled out here or there for women's sports. And it's inadequate, it's unjust to the people who have invested. These women have dreamed their whole lives of doing this. I mean, it's like some of the best athletes on the planet, and most of the WNBA players finish college, so there are a lot of really smart women with other interests outside of basketball, and it's denying everyone in the country, but especially younger women, the opportunity to see them. They need to be visible. People need to know that Chineye Ogwumike, played in a WNBA game and went sideline to interview her sister because she also works for ESPN, and like within the span of okay, game's over, let me go do this other job. I mean, that's phenomenal. Like, everybody should know that that is happening, but sadly that's not the case.
Yeah, I'll build off what you were saying. Tamryn used the word advocate, and I think that is such a powerful explanation for how women's sports often do receive coverage in news outlets that cover a wide range of sports. I've been interviewing sports reporters and sports editors over the past couple of years, and like the biggest, clearest idea that has come out of those interviews is, I have to advocate, I have to spend capital, I have to really push my editor to let me go cover the women's Final Four, for example. Even when there's a clear news angle, it's something that I have to advocate for. And one of the biggest challenges, unfortunately, is the metrics that we have access to at a news site like where I'm at, Knoxville News Sentinel. Those metrics are broadcast live digitally in the newsroom. Who is clicking on what. And when there's not an established audience for women's sports, and even in Knoxville, there is for women's basketball, it becomes very easy to point, well, no one's looking at this, so of course we can't cover it. And there's not an understanding that the media coverage is a very important ingredient in creating that audience. But taking it back to the COVID-19, even with this huge spike in readership, advertising is way down at news sites. And so when sports come back up, there's going to be an intensity toward creating content that generates a ton of page views. And that type of advocating is going to have to be even more powerful, I think. We're going to need those advocates on the inside to push for that women's sports content.
Yeah, let's hear from Jessica there, and then we'll go back up to Tamryn.
Yeah, I want to piggyback right off that, because we're seeing so much of sports media contracting in this moment. Like, just today is like the last day that a lot of writers at SB Nation are getting paid. They're going to be furloughed starting tomorrow for 3 months. SB Nation is so good on WNBA and WHL, the U.S. Women's soccer in general, including the U.S. Women's National Team, and that doesn't even include like all the other. I can't even list them all. It just feels like every day we see more sites and more newspapers losing sports content. And one thing I keep thinking about is we were already worried about women's sports before all of this happened. Like, they're constantly, historically, presently under-resourced, under-supported. And so much of what happens around women's sports is you're supposed to feel grateful that you get anything at all ever. And like, if you ever criticize what you do get, then how ungrateful you are for the little bit that we're giving you. And I feel like that's going to be amplified a lot after this is over. And I just wanted to also mention, we're talking about the media, and I obviously think that's really important. And I was ready to name names when I showed up. But, you know, I'm wearing this shirt, this U.S. women's national team. They turned their shirts inside out at the last She Believes match that they did because the U.S. soccer has not supported them, and they are suing. And they are one of many, many women's soccer teams around the world. FareNet, F-A-R-E-Net. My colleague at Burn It All Down, Brenda Elsey, she covers women's football in South America, and they are presently worried about all this stuff. And they just put out a press release yesterday about this. And one of the women they quoted in there, Vanessa Cordova, who plays for Colombia, like she said, this isn't even about COVID for us. This was a problem before, you know, like this has been historically an issue we've been dealing with. And so yes, it's bad for the media, but it's also like the men in charge of all these federations that and these organizations, and how I'm so worried about where they're going to put their attention and all the excuses that they'll have not to give money and time and spotlights to women after this.
We're seeing that already with the NCAA trying to get rid of the waiver of the number of sports that you have to maintain the Division I level. So they're saying like, oh, hey, if it's 14, you know, well, you can get rid of a couple. And of course, those are going to be non-Rev sports and women's sports. And that's troublesome for me. Tamryn, I'm sorry, it was your turn.
No, it's okay. Leaping off of the COVID thing. So we look at how often women are the last hired into sports newsrooms. Kind of have to, you know, bulldoze your way in. For me at The Athletic, you know, I bugged them for a year before they created a WNBA vertical. I was just like constantly contacting the NBA editors, and I was like, do you know what's happening in the WNBA? Like Diana Taurasi is now the all-time scorer in WNBA history. How are you not covering this? I will cover it for free because it needs to be out there. I mean, I feel that strongly about it. And so when it's time to scale back, then, okay, you know, we're the first to go. And will we be brought back? Will somebody like me be brought back who was outspoken about how we were let go? You know, I found out by reading an article in the media, and that's hurtful to people who care about what they do. And so what the opportunities, it's like, you know, women are just barely at the margins, and then something like this happens and it's like, okay, so we're not even at the margins anymore. You know, we're just completely, you know, off the grid. And the thing I never hear discussed, kind of going back to what Erin said about seeing the clicks in the newsroom and the pressure that creates is anybody concerned with the integrity of the reporting? You know, it's like before we were laid off or temporarily paused at The Athletic, I would have loved a conversation to say, hey, I'll renegotiate a lower rate to be able to keep covering it because we have the draft coming up. We don't know if the season's going to happen. Free agency moves are still happening. There's news to be covered. How are players coping with COVID? Most of the players during the WNBA offseason are playing overseas. What are their COVID risks? Which ones had it? How are they doing health-wise? So there's tons of stories that are out there to be covered. And I'm not the only one who was like, wow, I would have just renegotiated a lower rate for now to be able to keep covering it rather than just having the plug pulled. And then what does that do for our relationships with the players and coaches and teams and whatever that we, you know, come to build, you know, solid relationships with. I know one contributor who had a player like texting her saying, hey, I need to talk about this. This is a story that's happening. Will you write about it? And she was like mortified that she couldn't say, yes, I'll cover this, you know, because she was cut off, you know. So it does a disservice to women. You know, you can just see the trickle down effect. And then it also brings up, so how seriously do publications take women's sports anyway? If, okay, let's get rid of all the freelancers, which are mainly women. Overnight, The Athletic went to having no women of color covering the WNBA, you know, because we were all freelancers, the few of us who were there. And so, okay, let's just have some NBA guys fill in. You know, it's like, does anybody care about the people who've been there from the beginning, who really know the history of the league, who have invested a lot in it? Or, oh, well, anybody can do this, you know, and that's the signal that it sends that perpetuates the issue.
Yeah, I think one of the common themes that we're seeing through all this, whether we're talking about the impact on women's sports or the impact on women working in sports or sports media, is that the unfortunate thing is that it gives a lot of these people who are making the decisions a pass. I think it was Jessica who said that, there will be a lot of excuses that come out of this for why sports are contracted, or why, staffing, especially those who cover women's sports or even women who work in the industry, are laid off. It's just a pass. And I foresee that being especially the case. I worry, obviously, not only all women who work in the industry, but, I'm thinking just because of my frame of reference with research, but women working in the electronic sports media, especially those who are older, the industry is already looking for an excuse to let them go at the drop of a hat. And now we have this to go along with the financial impact of COVID. It's just bad news all around.
Guy, if you want to see, if you need to look back to see what's going to happen, you can literally go right to the last financial crisis. Between 2002 and the end of 2008, we saw the WNBA contract and the league fold. We saw, Sports Illustrated for Women, Condé Nast Women in Fitness, other media outlets collapse. To bring up, we talked about this. In January, Deloitte put out a trends to watch at the beginning of the year while the economy's strong. The number one thing in sports trends was an investment in women's sports. And if you have a business to buy sponsorship, this was the way to go. Coming off the Women's World Cup coattails, looking at the 2020 Olympics and the World Cricket Championships, this was it. And here we are, looking back already and saying, we're the first one. This is the first stuff to be cut.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one thing about the way that misogyny works is that it creates all these really easy narratives that people can tap into in these moments. And I feel like we saw it really well when the University of Cincinnati cut their men's soccer team, and Title IX was trending on Twitter almost immediately in the wake, because everyone wanted to blame the fact that women have any access to sport as the reason why men's soccer couldn't survive at Cincinnati, when in fact, there's like almost no school. I don't know if there is a school that's actually compliant with Title IX anywhere. Certainly not like in, as far as giving equal amounts of money to women's sports. And it's really men's football and basketball that suck all the money up. Like, it only took me 1 second to Google and find a report from like 4 years ago where the University of Cincinnati was paying $2.1 million in an old contract to Tommy Tuberville, who was terrible as a coach there. And so the men's soccer team is literally in Tommy Tuberville's just go away money that they're paying him. And so the idea that like women's field hockey is a reason that men's soccer is getting cut is, I'm not going to curse, is garbage. But I feel like one thing that misogyny does do is like, it makes the narrative so easy to tap into. Everyone went to Title IX because they knew to go there. And that's another thing that makes me nervous, and I want to be vigilant about, as whatever the after is, who knows what that will look like and when that will happen. But in the after, really paying attention to people tapping into those lazy, easy things that really focus on blaming women for things that are not their fault, and then taking stuff away from them in reaction to that.
Yeah,
So, believe it or not, we're actually already almost through a half an hour, but we're not going to stop just yet. In part because I want to give you all an opportunity to speculate a little bit about the after. Lindsey Gibbs wrote a really interesting piece, a provocative piece, suggesting that we should give women's sports a full month head start when we're able to come back to the courts and to the fields of play. That might provide one model, but I'm eager to hear from all of you about what you hope will happen in the after and what you think is likely to happen.
I hope Megan Rapinoe comes just tearing out, and the first thing that we get to talk about with women's sports is this lawsuit. And I know that doesn't sound like as exciting, as sexy as, let's get this league started, let's get playing. But the narrative around this lawsuit is powerful. And you have this incredibly likable group of women, from Carly Lloyd to Kelly O'Hara, to this whole group that people in this country connect with. And if that's the first thing that the women can get out on the page, you have little kids inspired. They want to see this team. For me, that's what I would like to see. And I just also want to add, God bless Lindsey Gibbs.
I would also say I'm curious as to how COVID will impact the entertainment industry. And the reason I mention that is because what happens in the entertainment industry, and by that I mean television and film, impacts what happens in sports. So if Hollywood, for example, has had to shut down operations and maybe TV episodes are slow to be produced, and the same thing with films, there is an opportunity there for TV networks to air more sports. And we know that in television, sports is the golden goose of TV programming, right? So there is an opportunity there, not just to air more sports in general, but also women's sports. So there's a potential that there's a void, a vacuum there that could be filled by women's sports. But as we've said earlier, the networks just need to take the step to get there. They need to be motivated, it seems, to do that.
And they should be, right? Because the WNBA draft did really well on ESPN.
Right.
Like, it was one of the best in, I don't remember how many years, but you're totally right. And I think, I mean, I'm so worried. I'm clearly worried about the after and people using it as an excuse, COVID. And all, I mean, things are so bad. Like, that's very true. And I am worried that that will be a great excuse to harm women's sports in the end. But it is also a great moment, right? Like, as Molly said at the very beginning, you don't need that much investment. Like, it's already there. The products are good. Just put them out there and put them on ESPN and tell your reporters to tweet about them, or like whatever. They have such potential. And I think what Lindsey was saying at Power Plays is like, yeah, give them a month, right? Like, if we would just put them on the front burner one time, we would see it. And because we saw it last year with the World Cup, the Women's World Cup, you know, like, we don't need more evidence that it would work. We just need someone to do the work.
I just wanted to add that I'm really looking forward to whether there's a WNBA season or not, whether that momentum and energy can be sustained. You know, we're talking about the virtual draft, the WNBA, Kathy Engelbert, the first ever commissioner, you know, put that together on the fly. And I wish that she got, you know, a bit more credit for that. The CBA that passed is groundbreaking for the players. And it really, of course, we're now in a total financial disaster in the country, but in normal times, it really does set a model for what workplaces across industries should be considering in terms of taking care of workers, especially working mothers. So I think, like, the players have been more excited for the 2020 season than I've seen in a decade. You know, tweeting about it because they finally are, oh wow, you know, maybe I won't have to play year round this year.
Free agency,
you know,
free agency was so fun.
Yeah, free agency was so fun. Everybody went everywhere else. And so the players are excited, the fans are excited. So I think even if this season doesn't happen, I think 2021 will just have even more juice behind it. Maybe that's pie in the sky thinking, but it's really what I hope. I know that the fans, you know, are locked in, and the players are as well. So we'll see.
I'll add just quickly, since I know we're out of time. I want to see all of those things. I will just add, I'd like to see a reckoning when it comes to athletic spending. In part, we were talking about Title IX earlier, in part because it's just so harmful for women's sports, and it's harmful for some of the men's sports that get caught up in that. No one wants to see sports eliminated, and that's what's happened. Old Dominion eliminated its wrestling team, Cincinnati, its men's soccer team, and we need more conversations about just how out of control this has gotten. I brought a short quote. I won't read the whole thing, but it was from Indiana Athletic Director Fred Glass. In 2019, Indiana reported a $13 million surplus. And Indiana is kind of notable because they haven't really got on the kind of train of just egregious spending for the most part. But then he says, it's been a goal of mine to build a reserve, but we just haven't been able to get there because of expenditures on facilities and competitive coaches' salaries and so forth. I mean, it's never ending, even when you have a surplus. And so I think, you know, rethinking college sports from a social justice angle would go far in helping us address some of these problems.
Well, you probably have given us, all five of you have given us some invitations for additional conversations and perhaps some other topics that might spin out of this particular conversation. We are going to unfortunately have to wrap up for this afternoon, but Tamryn Spruill, Jessica Luther, Molly Yanity, Erin Whiteside, Guy Harrison, can't thank you all enough for taking some time and sharing your expertise and insights with us. We certainly want to wish all of you individually the best and hope that you all stay healthy, and we'll, on behalf of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, certainly hope for the best for women's sports as well. I also want to thank everybody affiliated with the Moody College of Communication and all of our alumni and friends and students and parents who have joined us this afternoon. We really appreciate you taking some time with us. And of course, this will be available to you to be able to watch on our archives, which we'll make available to you very, very soon. So be looking for the next in the virtual town hall series from the Center for Sports Communication, as well as the next in the Moody mini series. And thanks again for spending some time with us today. Take care, everybody.